if you've come to a program by our UC Master Gardener program, you won't be surprised that I will be talking about setting up an integrated pest management program for weeds. I'll start by explaining what an integrated pest management program is, give you tips for identifying weeds and understanding their biology, discuss what makes weeds problematic, and suggest various strategies for managing them. We stress the importance of prevention, including practices such as hand weeding, using mulches, and planting with competitive plants. We will discuss how and when to use herbicides as a part of an IPM program. Finally, we will talk a little about how you might want to live with some of your weeds. Integrated pest management uses environmentally sound and effective science-based ways to keep pests from annoying you or damaging plants. Pests can be anything from deer to harmful insects to soil-based pathogens. Tonight, we're talking about weeds. An effective program combines several pest management practices to prevent and manage pest problems over the long term without harming you, your family, or the environment. Pesticides are applied as a last resort and least toxic methods are emphasized. In an IPM program, the goal is not to eliminate all weeds, but to keep them at a level you can live with. Create an IPM program using a combination of preventive methods, such as mulches and competitive plantings, and you can stay on top of your weed problems. If you don't plan ahead and prevent weeds from establishing, though, weeds can get the upper hand. IPM pest management methods have a hierarchy of practices from prevention at the base to more intervention further up, with impacts to the environment from benign at the bottom of the pyramid to increased toxicity at the top. We first need to identify and understand our garden pest. Cultural controls are practices that make it harder for pests to reproduce, disperse, and survive, and include planting methods, watering schedules, etc. Mechanical and physical controls kill a pest directly, block pests out, or make the environment unsuitable for it. Physical and mechanical practices are those that act directly on the pest, like pulling out weeds or using a mulch barrier. Biological control is the use of natural enemies, predators, parasites, pathogens, and competitors to control pests and their damage. All kinds of pests in your garden have natural enemies too. Healthy plants you like are competitors to the weeds that you don't. Chemical control, finally, at the apex of our pyramid, is the use of pesticides. Herbicides, such as glyphosate, is an example of a pesticide. Although weeds may be managed for a variety of reasons, the primary reason that people manage weeds is because they don't like the way they look. Residents want to get rid of undesirable plants in their lawns, gardens, and landscapes. Weeds can crowd out desirable plants by reducing light and air to them. They provide hiding places for pests such as insects, rats, and mice. Tall weeds can block signs or make it difficult to see around corners. Weeds coming up in cracks can accelerate the breakdown of pavement in your sidewalks and walkways. Weeds have an impact on human and pet health. Pet weed flowers can attract bees that may pose a danger to people with bee allergies. Poison oak can cause rashes, ragweed causes sneezes, and weed burrs or other parts can get stuck in pet fur, paws, eyes, etc. Heavy or woody weed infestations can pose a fire hazard. To climb the first step in our integrated pest management pyramid, we need to identify the weeds that are troubling you. Monitor your property regularly for weeds to see where, when, and which weeds are invading. There may be different types of weeds in different parts of your property and at different times of the year. Knowing which type of weed you have is necessary to determine the best management strategy. There are 3 general categories of weeds: broadleaf grasses and sedges. Broadleaf weeds, such as oxalis, also known as wood sorrel, and dandelions, have wide leaves of many different shapes with veins that branch out in various directions. Grasses, such as Dallas grass and large crabgrass, have narrow leaves with parallel veins. Sorry, I got all excited there. Arranged in sets of 2 with round or flattened stems. Now, that's going to be important because you will either be able to roll them in your fingers or you won't be able to roll them at all. Sedges, such as yellow nutsedge, have leaves that are arranged in sets of 3. Their stems are triangular in cross-section. So if you roll them between your fingers, they'll roll, but they'll go bumpity-bumpity. And you can remember this about them because sedges have edges. Many weeds are similar in appearance, but are really different species that require a different approach to management. It is important to identify your weed to species so that you can choose the most effective management practice for that weed. The UC Integrated Pest Management website online has numerous resources to help you identify and manage your weeds, including the Pest Notes series, a weed photo gallery, and a key to weeds and lawns. As an accompaniment to this presentation, you will be emailed a list of resources, including these, after you submit our survey that we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. The classic definition of a weed is any plant out of place, but that's both too broad and at the same time incomplete. We call plants weeds because they are competitive and invasive. In other words, weedy. What makes them competitive and invasive is that they generally grow and reproduce quickly. Most weeds spread by dispersing seeds. I've included a photo of that troublesome dandelion at its seediest, when it's so fun to blow its seeds all over Grandpa's front lawn. Other weeds may spread through plant parts, such as fleshy roots, tubers, stolons, which are stems that creep along the ground, or rhizomes, which are underground stems, which also spread underground. In addition to common weeds, watch out for invasions of lawn grasses and vigorously growing ground covers into areas of your landscape where you don't want them. Weeds or other undesirable plants often invade landscapes, gardens, or lawns with maintenance issues that favor them. Identifying the weed present can help you identify the maintenance issue. Once you fix it, that weed population should decrease. Keeping a record of which weeds you find around your yard can be helpful to determine if your management action is working. Following are some maintenance problems and weeds that commonly result from them. Areas that are overwatered or waterlogged because of bad water scheduling, irrigation scheduling, or a broken sprinkler or a leaky pipe or other water feature can become infested with weeds such as annual bluegrass, crabgrass, or nutsedge. Ah, nutsedge. Nutsedge is one of those weeds that if you take the stem and you roll it in your fingers, you will feel the edges and you will know it's a sedge. You might notice spotted spurge or knotweed in areas of your yard where the soil is compacted and other plants won't grow. Acting to loosen up the soil, though, may encourage the growth of competitive plants, which would be good if they're the ones you plant, but they may be other weeds. We will talk a little bit later about how to handle new plantings to decrease the number of weeds that may result. Lawns that are low in nitrogen attract white clover, black medic, and burr clover. Setting up an appropriate fertilization program for your lawn can reduce these types of weeds. Understanding the life cycle of weeds is key to managing them. Weeds are generally grouped as annual weeds or perennial weeds. Annual weeds complete their life cycle in one season. Annual weeds sprout from seeds, grow and develop flowers, die, and then produce more seeds and then die. The best time to control them is before they produce flowers and the seeds. Some common annuals include spotted spurge, crabgrass, annual bluegrass, and sow thistle. Again, you want to control annual weeds before they flower and produce seeds, because the seeds they disperse or leave in the soil will produce another population in the next season. Perennial weeds are much harder to manage than annual weeds. Perennial weeds live for more than one season. Plants grow from seeds, vegetative parts, or both. Those vegetative plant parts are the tubers, underground roots, stolons, and rhizomes I showed you earlier. They mature and then die back when the weather changes. But their underground plant parts can overwinter and form new plants the following season. It is easier to manage perennial plants before they can become established. Control perennials before those vegetative parts or seeds form. Some perennial weeds are Bermuda grass or oxalis. Oxalis is worthy of special mention because this is the time of year that it appears in our county. Pulling it up early and often is the key to, if not getting rid of it, slowing it down. Don't wait until the flowers appear. By then it is too late. Oxalis will have developed the plant parts that help it to spread. The 4 foundations of success provide the basis for our cultural care. We think of these foundations as good cultural care. Number 1 is the soil. Soil is the basis for a healthy garden. It is home actually to an entire system of living things. Not only your plant roots, but fungi, bacteria, and earthworms that all help to keep your plants healthy. Number 2 is water. Consistent moisture is the key. We all know that too much or too little water can be dangerous for plants. We also know that some plants have a bigger taste for water than others. Aeration is number 3. Many people underappreciate the importance of air in our soil. And yet, without the pore spaces in the soil, which allow the plants to obtain oxygen and the living things that live in the soil to breathe, the plants will not survive. Take care of those pore spaces. Number 4 is sun. Last but not least, energy from the sun is a driver for plant growth. Just as for water, too much or too little sunshine can create problems. In the larger context, soil and air temperatures, which are also determined by sunlight, are critical for plant health. It is worthwhile for you to investigate which planting zone is the area where you garden. Or anyway, you need to know, wherever you garden, it's very helpful to know which planting zone that area is in. Take advantage of your garden's life cycle to use cultural, physical, and biological controls to manage weeds. The techniques you will use to manage weeds will vary whether it's before you plant, before weeds emerge, and before weeds mature. In areas not yet planted, manage weeds before you plant. You will need to start several weeks before you want to start planting. Dig out the existing vegetation, making sure to get the roots and other underground vegetative parts. Cultivate the soil then. Irrigate it, to let the weeds germinate. And what you want to do is you want to wait then for 2 to 3 weeks for the remaining weed seeds and other plant parts that you've left behind in that area to start growing so that you can get a hold of them and remove all the newly germinated seedlings, leaving the area free as possible of competitive weeds. If you have some particularly persistent weeds, soil solarization is a technique that can control most weed seeds. After removing the vegetation, place a clear plastic tarp on the soil surface for about 4 to 6 weeks during the hottest part of summer. If you live in El Cerrito or another cooler part of the county, or if the piece of the area of your garden is in the shady part, this may not be the best technique for you. Because what solarization does is it relies on the sun to heat up your soil and basically bake the seeds and plant parts and killing them off. Unfortunately, it will also kill beneficial microbes and earthworms, which contribute to the health of your soil. So this is a consideration when deciding if this is the technique that you want to use, but it may be a situation where necessity demands. Another option, if you have serious weed problems with perennials or for a very large area, you may decide that this is a good time to apply a non-selective herbicide, and we'll talk about what that means. Your soil condition and plant selection are key components in controlling weeds. As always, healthy soil is key to planting success. Whether your soil is clayey, loamy, sandy, or some combination, soils must be sufficiently porous as well as able to hold water and nutrients so that your desired plant can establish a healthy root system. As we talked about before, number 1 is a healthy soil. Your soil must also have good drainage so that your new plants don't drown. You can amend your soil before planting. Please, though, get soil from a reputable site. Confirm with your supplier that it does not contain herbicide residues, weed seeds, nutsedge tubers, or other propagals. Select plants that are suitable for your climate zone, soil type, and location. Look at the tag or ask questions about the climate zone, soil type, or locations the new plant will tolerate. Check the sun available on your chosen site. Put sun-loving plants in sunny locations and shade-loving ones with less sun. A plant that's appropriate for its location will grow more quickly and be competitive against any potential weed growth. If you are growing larger plants or other plants that will have room between them, you may want to plant ground cover or other plants that will cover the bare areas so that they can shade out any competitive weeds. Switching from sprinkler irrigation to drip or other low output irrigation in landscape beds can reduce water use, which is a benefit during this drought, and also reduce extensive weed growth by focusing the watering on the soil around the plants you want to grow. For new lawns, make sure you properly prepare the planting site and select a grass plant that is adaptable to your conditions. A mixture of grass species can improve soil health, tolerate diverse conditions, and provide resistance to diseases. Once you have planted your new lawn, develop an appropriate fertilizing and watering schedule so that it will grow well and be competitive against any weeds. Mulches are very effective at preventing weed germination and growth. A mulch is a layer of material that is put on the soil surface around plants to prevent weeds from growing. They are particularly useful around widely separated plants when you don't want to plant a ground cover. Seedlings need light to grow. Mulches block the light and suppress the growth of many weeds. Many mulches also help to hold moisture in and reduce soil compaction and erosion. Some organic mulches, when they decompose, nourish the soil. Many materials are available as mulches: rock mulches, synthetic mulches, and organic mulch. Organic mulches are mulches that are composed of products that were once alive. It's a different usage than when we talk about organic vegetables and fruits that you buy in the supermarket or the local farmer's market. Organic mulches include wood chips, bark chips, sawdust, leaves, compost. Avoid mulches such as hay that may contain weed or grass seeds. If you want something like hay, make sure to ask for straw. Keep mulch at the proper depth. If it's too deep, air may not be able to penetrate. The soil may become too moist and subject to disease. Not applying mulches deep enough, though, can allow weeds to grow up through the mulch. The proper depth depends on the type of mulch you're using. Mulches with larger pieces can be applied more deeply. Generally, 2 to 3 inches is a good depth for a bark mulch. Organic mulch will break down over time, so you will need to replenish your mulch as needed and keep it at the proper depth for the type you're using. Keep in mind that even if used properly, mulches will never provide 100% control. Some perennial weeds may be invasive and aggressive enough to get through even thick layers of mulch. And seeds of some annual weeds may blow over from the neighbor's yard or some other area of the garden and germinate and grow on top as the mulch disintegrates. If weeds appear, remove them by hand when they are small. Avoid disrupting the mulch. Mulching, luckily, makes hand weeding easier because the material is looser, so it's much easier to pull the weeds out than it would from the ground itself. Rock mulches are more permanent than organic mulches and do not need to be replenished as often. They are also non-flammable, so are appropriate if you want to establish space around your home or other structures. However, rock mulches are difficult to keep clean Don't add anything to improve the soil. And if weed seeds do germinate, they may be harder to remove than they would from an organic mulch. Rock mulch may also become very hot in a sunny area and can impact nearby plants. Both rock and organic mulches are more effective if placed over a fabric barrier. Plastics and barrier fabrics are two types of synthetic mulches that are used under organic or rock mulches. Use landscape fabric, though. Avoid the use of plastic mulches. Unlike plastics, landscape fabrics allow water and air to pass through them and nourish the soil underneath for the nearby plants you want to grow. Landscape fabrics last longer than plastic and won't leave pieces of plastic behind in the soil. You do need to cover them with rock or organic mulch to protect them from damage from the sun. To install, put the fabric down with U-shaped nails. I use the staples that can be found in the irrigation section of the hardware store. Be sure to overlap the edges because the weeds will try to get through the cracks between the sheets that you've put down if you can't get a sheet big enough to cover the entire area that you want to cover. Cut an X in the fabric, dig a planting hole. Avoid leaving or pulling up the soil from the planting hole and leaving it on top of the fabric, as this could put weed seeds within the sun and cause them to germinate. Then place your plant in the hole and cover the fabric with a shallow mulch layer, about 1 inch deep. It doesn't need to be quite as deep as it would without a barrier fabric. If you are applying fabric to an already planted landscape, which is something you can do, lay the cloth close to the ground, securing it with the U-shaped nails or irrigation staples. Remember to overlap. You'll need to cut an X over the plant, which may be quite large X, so you may need to staple down some of the areas closer to the plant. You'll need to carefully pull your plant through the cloth and then cover the fabric with mulch. When you see weeds in your garden or landscape, the easiest way to remove them is just to pull them out. If you are looking for a magic bullet tonight, I'm sorry. Hand weeding remains the primary method for removing weeds in the garden and landscapes. But I have a few hints and suggestions to make the process easier. You can keep your weeds down if you remove them as soon as you see them. And remove them when they're small, before they have set seed or have developed the plant parts that enable them to spread. Make weeding part of your garden care routine, kind of like weekly lawn mowing, if you have or have had a lawn. You will need to weed more often, though, when it's rainy and warmish like it is now than you would in the middle of summer when things are much drier, or later on in the winter when it gets much colder. Both conditions are much less favorable for weed growth. I find weed pulling very therapeutic. I don't have to think very much other than not pulling up plants that aren't weeds. It is also helpful if I'm feeling frustrated. I could take my anger out on those annoying weeds. Be sure, and I think there was a question that was asked earlier, be sure to remove as much of the entire plant, including the weeds, as much as possible. Removing only the portion of the weed above ground may make the landscape look cleaner for a while, but new shoots may develop from the remaining underground parts. I carry around a 5-gallon plastic bucket, like you sometimes get at the hardware store, and throw the weeds I've pulled out in there. By not throwing the weeds in a pile in my garden or landscape, I make sure that any weed seeds or spreading plant parts Don't slip away from me and start regrowing. This is particularly a problem right now when the soil and air are damp. Weeds don't dry out quickly and die like they tend to do on a hot summer's day. When the bucket is full, I'm finished for the day. My back and knees appreciate limits. I then drop the contents of my bucket in the green bin. I don't put weeds in the compost pile because my compost doesn't get hot enough to kill any weed seeds or other plant parts. Irrigate a few hours before pulling weeds out to make it easier to remove the entire plant. Damp soil is much easier to dig into, especially if it's clayey, than is hard packed dry soil. A good time to weed is right now after it rains. And grasp the weed by its base, rock it back and forth to loosen its roots, and then pull up. Several tools are available to make hand weeding easier. To control perennial weeds, you must dig up and destroy all the roots and underground stems and tubers. Weed knives, dandelion knives, or even screwdrivers can help dig out the weeds and their roots while reducing the disturbance to the soil. Because remember, if you disturb the soil unduly, you're going to be bringing up other weed seeds into the sun and causing them to germinate. And you may get more weeds where after you pulled out one, and then you get 10. Hand tines help to loosen the soil around larger weeds. Now, that said, you may need, in order to get the weeds out, you may need to loosen the soil somewhat, especially when you have a large collection of smaller weeds. So the hand tines will help you dislodge the weed seedlings in small areas. Annual weeds can be controlled with various types of hoes. You use a garden hoe to cut out the weeds with a chopping motion at the soil surface or slightly below the soil surface. Roots, again, as we discussed in the question and answer period, are less of a concern with annual weeds than they are with perennial weeds. You can also use a push-pull hoe or a hula hoe, scraping back and forth on the surface of the dry soil to cut small weeds off as low as possible on their basal stem. At my home, we do something similar with a weed whacker. We use a weed whacker on large areas of annual or grassy weeds before they start developing their flowers and seeds. They are going to come back, they're going to grow again. So we have to do this several times during the weed season. Hopefully, by getting them out before they develop flowers or seeds, we will have much less of a problem next year. I like to use my hori-hori knife. Its sharp edge is excellent for digging into hard soil, and its longer blade can get in very deeply. Be careful, though, with this tool around children. It's very sharp. You'll notice I put red tape on the handle after I lost one of my hori-hori knives in the mulch, since it camouflages very well. Certain adaptive gardening tools are available for people with special needs, such as those bound to a wheelchair or suffering from arthritis, back pains, or some other physical challenges. Some of these tools have ergonomic handles to keep your hands and wrist in a natural position, or longer handles to allow you to garden from a seated position. Hot water and flaming are two alternate ways to control weeds. They work best as spot treatments in pavement cracks and along fence lines where it may be difficult, almost impossible, to pull weeds out by hand. Hot water or steam treatments are most effective against annual or young perennial weeds. You apply the treatment to the foliage and stem. You don't need any special equipment to use hot water. I just heat up the water in my tea kettle and pour the contents on the weeds in my front walk. being careful not to scald myself. The treatment won't kill the deeper roots, so established perennial weeds can regrow. And so I find myself doing this a few times during the weed growing season. As well as along fence lines and in pavement cracks, flaming with a propane torch can control weeds on bare soil. You kill the weeds by pressing the flame over the weed leaves, which causes the cells in them to burst. Flaming is most effective against young annual weeds. As with hot water, deeper roots and plant parts are not killed, so perennial weeds and grasses can regrow. Be careful. Avoid flaming when winds are high, on poor air quality days, or when the fire danger is high. I'm including these photos because they show what the propane torch used for flaming looks like, but not for where it's being used. Don't use flamers near wood chips, dry weeds, or other flammable materials. You can start a fire. Animals, such as ducks, goats, or geese, are sometimes used to control weeds. Goats may be used to control weeds on hillsides or in areas ready to be planted. Geese can be used to control young grassy weeds or sedges in small vegetable gardens. Other animals, such as chickens, are usually not selective in what plants they feed on, so be careful not to use them around desirable plants. Protect them from dogs or other predators, of course, and don't use these animals in areas where herbicides or other pesticides have been or are being applied. Be sure to provide them with other food sources and water and dispose of their animal waste properly. Do you need herbicides? Herbicides are pesticides that are designed to control weeds. A well-designed and well-maintained landscape generally does not require herbicides. Many gardeners never use them. Reserve herbicides for special problem situations, such as infestations of difficult to control perennial weeds, or before establishing new plantings. Don't rely on them exclusively. Before doing anything, though, you need to figure out whether you have an underlying maintenance problem and work from there. For example, if you have crabgrass, you may be overwatering or have leaky sprinklers. Once you have fixed the underlying problem, first use preventative methods such as mulch, competitive planting, or then cultivate and use hand weeding to make future herbicide use unnecessary. If you do use herbicides, choose one that is labeled for the type of weed that you are trying to control, and it is safe for use around desirable plants in the area. Note that some weeds are becoming resistant to herbicides. Fleabane and ryegrass are now resistant to glyphosate. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. And I mentioned glyphosate earlier, and I should have mentioned what it was because years ago, I would not have recognized what it was. And glyphosate will only kill parts of oxalis. Remember, I mentioned oxalis is a particularly pernicious weed at this time, but it will only kill the parts of oxalis that you can see. Even after spraying, oxalis that is flowered will continue to grow via the underground plant parts. Herbicides are applied as pre-emergent or post-emergent and are selective or non-selective. Pre-emergent herbicides are applied before weed seedlings emerge from the soil, while post-emergent herbicides are applied on the weeds after they've emerged. Selective herbicides are designed to kill specific types of weeds, such as broadleaf weeds or grasses, without damaging other plants. Non-selective herbicides kill all or most vegetation. and can be the best choice for an herbicide when preparing planting sites. Injury to many ornamental or garden plants may result when label instructions are not followed, but it can also occur when drift or runoff takes the herbicide to neighboring plants. Runoff is when the herbicide is spread by water, drift by air. Drift damage can occur quite a distance from the spray zone. Trees with roots growing under lawns may be affected by some herbicides applied to the lawn. Tree roots can spread at a surprising distance from the trunk of the tree, and most are not deeper than 18 inches below the soil. 3 herbicides that have been associated with plant injury are glyphosate, dicamba, and 2,4-D. Glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide. That means that it kills all or most plants. It can cause injury easily by drifting on non-target plants. Roses are especially sensitive. Affected leaves appear needle-like, yellow, or mottled with small growth. Rose bushes may be compromised for years after they've been affected by glyphosate and never recover the vigor they once had. Dicamba is a selective herbicide for use on broadleaf weeds and often used in weed and feed products on lawns. If not used according to the product label, dicamba can damage trees and plants, causing dwarfed or distorted foliage. 2,4-D is a selective herbicide and is often used in lawns to kill broadleaf weeds. However, it can cause injury to nearby trees and shrubs if it drifts onto their leaves. Be sure to use caution before, during, and after using any pesticide. Follow all directions on the product label and wear the proper protective clothing. You see this gentleman here spraying is wearing an coverall, gloves, hat, and goggles. He also might consider using a mask. Like the gentleman at the top, check the label for the active ingredient. Make sure it is labeled for the type of weed you are trying to control and that it is registered for the area where you are planning on using it. Don't apply right before rain is expected or on a windy day. If you live in a windy area, choose the time of the day before the wind picks up. Don't irrigate soon afterwards. Before you apply any pesticide, think about whether other people or pets are likely to enter the area where you are applying that pesticide. Make sure to warn them verbally or post warning signs so that they don't walk through treated areas. Mix up only the amount you need, making sure to follow the directions and doing the appropriate proportions that are given on the label instructions. After you've finished, if you don't use all of the pesticide, don't wash any extra down the drain. Dispose of it properly. There are sites in Contra Costa County that accept hazardous waste. Use them. Weeds aren't all bad. They grow in compacted and nutrient-deprived soil. Their roots can break up that soil. Dandelions actually bring up nutrients to the surface. Some weeds, like certain clovers, are nitrogen fixers, and along with ryegrass, may be used as components in cover crops that you can use in your garden, vegetable gardens between growing seasons. Grasses that you don't want in your vegetable garden or flower bed can be used to stabilize the soil and slopes and prevent erosion. Many weeds, like milkweed, attract butterflies and feed bees and other pollinators. Some weeds are tasty. Which ones that are for another talk. and many have flowers that are beautiful. So finally, you need to reassess your weed management program by determining, is your approach working? Well, the important question is, are weeds decreasing in your landscape? If you have properly managed the area using competitive plantings, barriers such as mowing strips and well-maintained mulches, and adjusted your irrigation system, you should see a decrease in weeds in your yard. And also develop a routine to, like I said, like mowing your yard, to remove weeds regularly as you see them and before they set seed.